This happened during Carnival in 2019 in Recife. I was 24, finishing my architecture degree and working part-time at a small design studio. Back then, my life was pretty normal: classes, work, and occasional parties. But during Carnival, everything changed. My friends and I lived for those nights. We weren't just party-goers. We were explorers, hunting for the weirdest, most underground street blocks. That's how we first heard about O Bloco dos Mortos, a bloco that, according to urban legends, only appeared in the darkest alleys after midnight. The rumor was simple but eerie. People who joined the dance were never seen again. We laughed it off, of course, but deep down we were intrigued. That Friday, the third night of Carnival, we made a plan. If this bloco existed, we were going to find it. We stuck to the less crowded streets, following distant drum beats and flickering lantern lights. Around 2 a.m., we found ourselves in a narrow alley in the old part of town, near an abandoned colonial building. That's when we heard it: soft, rhythmic drumming, faint but distinct. No electric trio, no neon lights, just a slow, hypnotic rhythm, the kind that seeps into your bones. We exchanged excited glances. This had to be it. The alley was dimly lit, but as we stepped forward, figures emerged from the darkness, moving in perfect unison, their feet barely touching the ground. We stood there, frozen, watching them. At first glance, they looked like any other revelers: colorful masks, intricate costumes, the shimmer of sequins catching the weak streetlight. But something was off. Their movements were too fluid, too synchronized, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. No one was talking, no laughter, no drunken stumbling. Just that slow, dreamlike dance. The drumming grew louder, vibrating in my chest, making my pulse sync with its beat. Then, one of them turned toward us. His mask was a golden skull, beautifully crafted, but his eyes were empty. Not dark, not shadowed, just empty. Before any of us could react, the masked figures shifted, their dance subtly changing direction, pulling us in like a tide. My friend Lucas, always the boldest, grinned and stepped forward. "Come on, let's check it out," he said, already swaying to the rhythm. We hesitated, but the energy was magnetic, intoxicating. One by one, we followed. As soon as our feet touched the worn cobblestones, a strange sensation crawled up my legs, like stepping into ice-cold water. The air thickened. The city sounds, distant music, laughter, fireworks, faded into a dull hum. It was just us, the dancers, and the relentless, hypnotic drum. As we moved deeper into the bloco, something strange happened. The world outside seemed to dissolve. The buildings, the flickering streetlights, even the sky above, everything blurred at the edges, as if we had stepped into another layer of the city, one that existed only for them. My skin prickled. The dancers never spoke, never acknowledged us, but the way they moved, it felt like they were guiding us, pushing us further in. I tried to speak to Lucas, to tell him we should leave, but my voice came out muffled, as if the air itself swallowed my words. He didn't even turn around. None of my friends did. They were locked in the rhythm, their bodies moving in perfect sync with the masked figures. Panic rose in my chest. I grabbed Julia's wrist, trying to pull her back, but the moment I touched her, a jolt of cold shot through me, like I had grabbed a corpse. She turned her head slightly, and that's when I saw it. Her face pale under the streetlight, her pupils blown wide, like someone in a trance. "Julia," my voice cracked. She blinked slowly, as if recognizing me for the first time, then smiled, a slow, eerie smile that wasn't hers. I turned to the others, my heart pounding. One by one, their faces changed. Their expressions slackened. Their movements became smoother, too smooth. And then, the realization hit me like ice water. They were no longer dancing with the bloco. They were part of it. I staggered back, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. My friends, Lucas, Julia, Rafa, Danny, were gone. Not physically, they were still there, moving, swaying, but they weren't them anymore. Their eyes had that same eerie emptiness as the masked dancers. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move, locked in the rhythm of the drum. The beat was inside me now, pulsing through my veins, each thud pulling me deeper. And then, the dancers turned toward me, all at once. Their movements were slow, deliberate, like puppets waiting for their strings to be pulled. One of them stepped forward. A woman in a crimson mask, embroidered with gold filigree. Up close, I could see her skin wasn't just pale, it was almost translucent like wax. She extended a hand, her fingers impossibly long, beckoning me. My vision blurred at the edges, my thoughts drowning in the rhythm. Just one step closer and I'd be lost. I knew it, but even knowing that, the pull was unbearable. My foot lifted off the ground before I could stop it, and then, boom, a firework exploded somewhere nearby, shattering the trance for a split second. That was all I needed. I turned and ran. I ran blindly, shoving past the dancers, expecting them to grab me, pull me back in. But they didn't. They just kept moving, their bodies swaying, their empty eyes staring past me as if I had ceased to exist. The air felt thicker, heavier, like I was wading through water. Every step was a struggle. My legs burned, but I didn't stop. The alley stretched longer than it should have, the exit always just a few steps ahead, but never quite within reach. Panic clawed at my throat. Had I already crossed into whatever place they came from? Then suddenly I broke free. The sounds of Carnival slammed into me all at once. Music, laughter, shouting. I stumbled onto a main street, the warmth of reality washing over me. Gasping, I turned back. The alley was there, but the Bloco was gone. No drummers, no dancers, no masks. Just an empty, silent path. I spun in circles, searching for my friends, but they were nowhere. I screamed their names, shoving past revelers, begging someone to help. But no one had seen them. No one had seen anything, as if they had never been there at all. I didn't stop searching. I ran through the streets, checking every alley, every side road, calling their names until my throat was raw. People looked at me like I was crazy, just another drunk lost in the chaos of Carnival. But I wasn't drunk. I was alone. My hands trembled as I pulled out my phone. I called Lucas, straight to voicemail. Julia, voicemail. Rafa, Danny, nothing. I checked our group chat. The last messages were from earlier that night, full of excitement, laughing emojis, plans to meet up. And then silence, as if they had vanished from the world the moment we stepped into that alley. Desperate, I ran back to where it all started. The abandoned colonial building, the alleyway where the Bloco had appeared. It was just an empty street now. No signs of the drummers, no footprints in the dust, nothing. But something caught my eye, half hidden in the gutter, shimmering under the dim streetlights. A golden skull mask, the same one the dancer had worn when he turned to look at me. My hand shook as I picked it up. It was warm, as if someone had just been wearing it. I dropped it and staggered back, ball rising in my throat. This wasn't just a legend. The Bloco dos Mortos was real, and had taken them. I don't remember getting home that night. Everything after finding the mask is a blur. I must have wandered for hours, lost in shock, before finally making it back to my apartment. The next few days were a nightmare. I filed missing persons reports, talked to their families, retraced our steps 100 times. But no one had seen anything. No security cameras, no witnesses, nothing. It was like they had been erased. The police humored me at first, but I could tell they didn't believe a word. People disappeared during Carnival all the time, one officer said with a shrug. They'll turn up, but they never did. Weeks passed, then months. The festival ended, life moved on, but I couldn't. I avoided music, crowds, anything that reminded me of that night. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the drumming, felt the pull of the rhythm. And sometimes, sometimes I saw them. In my dreams, in reflections, in the corner of my eye. Lucas, Julia, Rafa, Danny, swaying to a silent beat, their faces slack, their eyes empty. Watching, waiting. The worst part? I started hearing the drum beats at night. Faint, distant, but getting closer. Carnival is coming again soon, and I know they're coming with it. I was never the kind of person who got too involved in Carnival. Sure, I enjoyed the music, the energy, and the endless flow of beer, but the whole dressing up thing was never my style. That year, though, something pushed me to go all in. Maybe it was the friends I hadn't seen in ages. Maybe it was the heat of Rio's summer. Or maybe, just maybe, it was something else. I was in the middle of the Sambadrome, surrounded by a sea of bodies dancing to the rhythm of the drums, when I saw it. A mask, just lying there on the pavement, half trampled by the crowd. It was strange. Intricate patterns carved into dark, aged wood, with hollow eyes that seemed too deep. Something about it felt wrong, but I was drunk, excited, and stupid. Without thinking much, I picked it up and put it on. The moment it touched my skin, a shiver ran down my spine. It wasn't just cold, it felt alive, like a second skin molding itself to my face. I laughed, brushing off the weird sensation, and turned to show my friends. But they were gone. The crowd swirled around me like a living thing, colors blending together in a dizzying blur. My vision swam, my heartbeat pounded in my ears, and for a second, I felt displaced, like I wasn't entirely inside my own body. I tried to take the mask off, but my fingers met only smooth, unyielding wood. No straps, no edges, nothing to grip. Panic started to rise in my chest. I pushed harder, clawing at my own face, but it was no use. The mask wasn't coming off. I stumbled through the crowd, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. People brushed past me, laughing, shouting, oblivious to my struggle. I tried to call out, but my voice came out muffled, distorted, like I was speaking from underwater. My hands kept clawing at the mask, my nails scraping against the wood, but felt like my own skin now, fused, seamless. The worst part? No one seemed to notice. A woman in a glittering gold costume turned to me, her eyes locking onto mine for a second too long. She tilted her head, almost as if she could see my fear, but then she was gone, swallowed by the rhythm of the parade. Then the changes began. At first, they were subtle, a weird heaviness in my limbs, a strange detachment from my own movements. My fingers twitched when I wasn't telling them to. My legs moved a second before my brain gave the command. It was like my body was hesitating, lagging behind something else. And then came the whispers. Not loud, not distinct, but there at the back of my skull, curling around my thoughts like smoke. Words I didn't understand, an ancient, guttural murmur that didn't belong to me. I tried to focus, to push it away, but the more I fought it, the stronger it became. I forced myself to move, shoving through the crowd, desperate to find a quiet place to think. My legs felt sluggish, like I was wading through deep water, but I pushed on. Ducking into a side street, I leaned against a wall, panting. The whispers were louder now, weaving through my thoughts, threading into my own voice. I shook my head violently, trying to shake them loose. "Who are you?" I thought almost instinctively. And then, to my horror, something answered. Not in words, not exactly. It was more like a sensation, a knowing. "I am home," it whispered. Thought? I wasn't sure, but I felt it deep in my bones, as if the mask had always been a part of me, waiting for the right moment to wake up. My fingers twitched again, then my hands flexed, but I hadn't moved them. My body wasn't mine anymore. The panic surged back, raw and electric. I tried again to rip the mask off, yanking with everything I had, my nails scraping against my own face until I felt the sting of skin breaking. But the mask didn't move. It laughed, not out loud, but inside me, a dry, rasping amusement that made my stomach churn. I don't know how long I stood there, trembling in that alleyway, but when I finally looked up, the street had changed. The neon lights, the scattered beer cans, the distant pulse of samba. It was all wrong. The buildings seemed older, the walls covered in symbols I didn't recognize. The air smelled thick, damp, like old earth after a storm. People passed by, but their faces were blurred, like smudged paint on a canvas. My chest tightened. This wasn't Rio. At least, not the Rio I knew. A shape emerged from the shifting crowd. A tall figure draped in fabric that rippled like liquid shadow. No face, no eyes, just a hollow void beneath a heavy hood. It raised a hand, long fingers curling like smoke, and though it never spoke, I understood. It was waiting for me. My feet moved without my permission, carrying me forward. My mind screamed, but my body no longer belonged to me. The mask was pulling me toward the figure, and deep inside, I felt something unraveling. Memories slipping. What was my name? My past blurred at the edges, dissolving like ink in water. I fought against it, digging my heels into the ground, but my body wasn't mine anymore. My arms twitched, my fingers flexed, my breath came in ragged gasps that weren't entirely my own. The figure stood motionless as I was pulled closer, its presence radiating something ancient, hungry. The whispers in my head swelled into a chorus, overlapping voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. And then, just as my feet crossed the threshold between us, the world split open. It was like falling and being torn apart at the same time. The buildings, the people, the street, it all peeled away like old wallpaper, revealing something underneath. A vast, endless void, rippling with shapes that slithered just beyond comprehension. I saw faces flicker in the darkness, mouths moving in silent screams. They were like me, trapped, hollow, lost. I tried to scream, but the sound twisted inside my throat, warping into something that wasn't human. My reflection flashed in a window nearby, and what I saw made my blood freeze. The mask had changed. Its wooden surface had fused into my skin completely, veins of black seeping from the edges, sinking into my flesh like roots. My eyes, they weren't mine anymore. I don't know how I did it. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, but I forced my body to move. Every step felt like I was pushing against the tide, like something unseen was trying to drag me back. My own limbs resisted, muscles locking up, but I clenched my fists and ran. I didn't know where I was going. The streets twisted, stretched, and shrank around me like a living thing. Doors led to nowhere. Alleyways looped back to the same place. But I kept running, driven by one thought. I can't let it take me. Then I saw him. An old man sitting at the corner of a flickering street lamp, his eyes sharp despite his frail body. He watched me with the look of someone who knew. When I stumbled toward him, breathless, his expression didn't change. "You put on," he said. Not a question, just a cold statement. "Now I want to stay." I grabbed his shoulders, my fingers digging into his thin frame. "How do I get off?" My voice didn't even sound like mine anymore. The old man sighed, as if he'd seen this before, and pulled something from his pocket, a small, jagged mirror. I stared at the mirror, my stomach twisting. My reflection was barely recognizable. The mask had become part of me, its dark veins spreading down my neck. My eyes, now deep pits of shadow, blinked back at me. The old man held the mirror up higher. "Look," he commanded, his voice heavy with something that felt older than him. The moment my gaze locked onto my reflection, a jolt of pain shot through my skull. The whisper screamed. My head throbbed, as if something inside was being ripped apart. The mask convulsed against my skin, shifting like it was alive. I felt my mind stretch, pull, and for a terrifying moment, I thought it would snap. The figure from before, the one waiting for me in the void, it was there in the mirror. Its faceless hood loomed just behind my reflection, its fingers reaching toward me. But the old man shoved the mirror closer, forcing me to stare. The mask began to peel away. It wasn't like removing something from my face. It was like tearing away a part of myself. The mask resisted, clinging to my skin with tendrils of darkness that burned as they unraveled. My own scream mixed with the wailing voices inside my head, a chorus of agony and rage. The old man held firm, muttering words I didn't understand, his grip like iron on my shoulder. Then with a final, sickening snap, the mask ripped away. I collapsed to the ground, gasping, my face drenched in sweat. The mask lay beside me, no longer fused to my skin, but still breathing. Its wooden surface pulsed, its hollow eyes filled with something that hated me. The old man didn't hesitate. He pulled a cloth from his coat and wrapped the mask in it, whispering something under his breath. When he looked at me again, his expression was grim. "Leave," he said, "now, and don't ever look for it again." I didn't argue. My body felt hollow, drained, like I'd barely escaped drowning. I stumbled to my feet, every muscle aching, my head pounding with the ghost of those whispers. The old man turned away, tucking the wrapped mask deep into his coat like it was some venomous thing. "Go," he repeated, his voice sharper this time, "before it finds another way back." I didn't need to be told twice. I staggered out of the alley, and the moment I crossed back onto the main street, everything snapped back to normal. The neon lights, the music, the familiar chaos of Carnival, all as if nothing had happened. People laughed, danced, completely unaware that I had just fought for my soul. I reached up, touching my face, half expecting to feel the mask still there. But my skin was bare, raw. I was me again, or at least I think I was, because sometimes late at night, when the world is quiet, I still hear it, the whispers, and I wonder if I ever truly got away. I was never the superstitious type. Grew up in Rio, spent my whole life surrounded by folklore and ghost stories, but I always laugh them off. That was until the night I marched with Gremio Recreativo Unio de Gloria in the 2018 Carnival. I was one of the percussionists in the bateria, the beating heart of the school. That year, we were desperate. After years of losing, our mestre, SEU Adamar, had promised that our rhythm would be unlike anything ever played before. We all thought it was just his way of hyping us up. We had no idea what we were walking into. The night of the parade, something felt off. The air was thick, heavy, like the whole avenue was holding its breath. We were lined up, drums strapped on, waiting for the signal to start. That's when SEU Adamar gathered us close. His eyes were darker than usual, sunken, like he hadn't slept in weeks. "Remember," he said, voice low, almost reverent. "No matter what happens, don't stop playing." We exchanged glances, confused. What did he mean by that? Before we could ask, the fireworks blasted overhead. It was time. The first few minutes were electric. The crowd roared, the dancers glided in perfect harmony, and our drums shook the night. But then we hit the special rhythm, the one SEU Edamar had drilled into us relentlessly. It wasn't a normal samba and Rito beat. It had a strange pulse, something that crawled under my skin, making my fingers move on their own. The moment we locked into that groove, the energy around us shifted. The cheers from the stands wavered, as if the crowd had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Then it started. A dancer near the front jerked unnaturally mid-step, her body contorting as if invisible hands were pulling at her limbs. Another drummer beside me gasped, his eyes wide with terror. I followed his gaze and saw a man in the crowd clawing at his face, his mouth stretched open in a silent scream. One by one, people started convulsing, some falling to their knees, others standing stiff as statues, their heads snapping back as if listening to something beyond our world. My hands trembled against the drum, but I remembered SEU Adamar's warning. Don't stop playing. The rhythm took on a life of its own. My hands weren't mine anymore. They moved like puppets, pounding the drum with a force that rattled my bones. I tried to slow down, to break free of the beat, but my arms wouldn't listen. Around me, the rest of the bateria was the same, eyes wide, terror-stricken, but trapped in the rhythm. The air reeked of sweat and something foul, like meat left too long in the sun. Then, from deep within the crowd, a sound rose above the drums, a guttural, wet gurgling, like something struggling to breathe through a throat full of sludge. I turned my head, and my stomach dropped. The people who had frozen minutes before were moving again, but not like humans. Their limbs twitched at unnatural angles, heads rolling loosely on their necks as they stumbled forward. Their eyes, where there should have been whites, were now black voids. One of them, a man in a ripped abaya, locked eyes with me. Or at least, I think he did. His mouth stretched into an inhuman grin, and then, in perfect time with our bacteria, he started dancing. Not joyfully. His movements were jagged, broken, like his body was being yanked around by unseen strings. And he wasn't the only one. Panic surged through me, but I couldn't stop playing. None of us could. The rhythm had its claws in us, and the parade moved forward like a possessed machine. The infected dancers multiplied, spilling from the stands onto the avenue, their bodies twisting in unnatural, feverish movements. Their mouths gaped open, but no screams came, just that sick, wet gurgling like something trying to claw its way out of their throats. The crowd, the real crowd, had finally realized something was horribly wrong. I saw people pushing toward the exits, climbing over chairs, trampling each other in sheer terror. But it was too late. Then, as if the entire avenue had been plunged into a nightmare, the lights flickered and dimmed, casting eerie shadows over the possessed dancers. The floats, once grand displays of color and culture, now looked grotesque in the weak light. Statues of erixes and folkloric beings twisted into monstrous figures. And at the center of it all, SCU Adamar stood with his arms raised, his face blank, his body rigid. His mouth moved, forming words I couldn't hear over the relentless pounding of the drums. But I felt that he was the one keeping this going. I don't know what came over me, but I knew I had to break free. My hands ached from the relentless drumming, my pulse matching the cursed rhythm. I turned to the drummer beside me, Joao, a guy I'd known since we were kids. His face was slack, his eyes vacant, but his hands never missed a beat. Desperate, I did the only thing I could think of. I slammed my elbow into his drum, throwing the beat off. The moment the sound wavered, Joao gasped as if coming up for air, his eyes darting around in terror. That was it. The rhythm was the key. I turned to the others, shouting, kicking at their drums, anything to make them break the pattern. Some snapped out of it immediately, staggering back like they'd been yanked from a nightmare. But others didn't wake up. Their fingers bled from beating the drums raw, their bodies jerking violently with the rhythm, completely lost. And SCU Adamar, he turned to me then, his eyes burning with something not human. His lips pulled back into a grin, and in a voice that wasn't his, he whispered, "You shouldn't have done that." Before I could react, SCU Adamar lifted his arms, and an invisible force crashed down on me like a tidal wave. My knees buckled, my chest tightened, and for a moment, I thought my heart would explode from the pressure. Around me, the possessed dancers convulsed in unison, their twisted movements becoming more violent. The drums that were still playing boomed louder, as if the avenue itself was breathing with them. I felt something slithering into my mind, an ancient, insatiable hunger, and I knew that if I let it in, I'd be lost like the others. With every ounce of strength I had left, I threw myself backward, reaching for the nearest drum and flipping it over. The sound cracked through the night like a gunshot. A ripple of silence followed, spreading through the materia like a shattering mirror. The rhythm faltered. The dancers froze mid-contortion. And then chaos. The lights above burst in a rain of sparks. The speakers let out an ear-piercing screech, and every single possessed person let out a shriek so inhuman it made my blood turn to ice. I clamped my hands over my ears, eyes locked on SCU Adamar. His face twisted in fury as his body began to shake violently, like something inside him was trying to break free. SCU Adamar's body convulsed, his mouth stretching open wider than humanly possible, as if something inside him was being ripped out. The possessed dancers collapsed like puppets with cut strings, their bodies hitting the pavement with sickening thuds. A deafening boom echoed through the avenue as the last drum fell silent. And then, just like that, it was over. The air, thick with the stench of sweat and decay, suddenly felt lighter. The darkness that had clung to us like a second skin peeled away, leaving only the stunned silence of a crowd too terrified to understand what they had just witnessed. I scrambled to my feet, my heart hammering, my body aching as if I'd been fighting for hours. Joao was beside me, panting, his face slick with sweat and tears. The others who had snapped out of it looked just as wrecked. SUMR lay motionless in the center of it all, his body unnaturally still. For a moment, I thought he was dead, but then, with a shuddering breath, he opened his eyes, empty, glassy, like he wasn't really there anymore. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just was. And somehow, that was more terrifying than anything else that had happened that night. The sirens came next. Paramedics, police, journalists. None of them could make sense of what had happened. The official story became a mass hysteria event, heat exhaustion, maybe even drugs. But those of us in the Bateria knew the truth. We saw it. We felt it. Some of the dancers who had collapsed never woke up. Others came to, but they weren't the same. They spoke in whispers, flinched at certain sounds, and refused to talk about that night. SCU Adamar was taken away. Unresponsive, eyes staring blankly at nothing. Last I heard, he was in a psychiatric hospital, still catatonic, still breathing but empty. I never played the drums again. Couldn't even hear a samba in Rio without my hands shaking. I moved away from Rio, left the world of Carnival behind, but sometimes, late at night, I still hear it. A faint rhythm, just at the edge of my hearing. And sometimes, God help me, I feel my fingers twitch like they remember.